we've been following the Sunrise Movement and the climate strikes, filming them. And I've been hearing a lot of kids saying a lot of the same things that the uninhabitable Earth has been saying, which it seems like everybody's reading right now. I've kind of had like a few testy moments with my ego as, like you, a longtime environmentalist that was at all those movements. I keep hearing both the uninhabitable Earth and the kids saying, well, we had all this time and nothing changed. Politics made no movement forward. What I keep having to say is I feel like they have two advantages. One is the internet, so they can access the IPCC report that talks about 1.5 degrees warming, right? And the other thing they have is proof. In the 90s, when we were talking about climate change, it was like mildly, strangely warmer winter, and now they've got like the maybe category 6 hurricane on the horizon. I think the work that we did, a lot of the digging of ditches is the individual action, the direct action, the building of community, the finding the intersectionality. How do you respond when people say, well, it's just about changing the politics because the onus can't be on the individuals because it's too big, the scale's too big?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing. And I think this idea that the scale of the problem, it's important that we grapple with the scale of the problem, but the scale of the problem does not dictate the scale of the solutions. If you actually only think about climate disruption as being as atmospheric concentrations of CO2 on a planetary scale disturbance, and you think that that's how the solutions have to be crafted at some planetary scale, you miss the reality that climate disruption is just the emergent consequence of destroying ecosystems everywhere on the ground. And actually, the point of intervention isn't necessarily this idea that we're going to come up with one big answer that everybody has to follow, but actually devolving resources and power and decision-making down to the level of communities where people can actually make decisions that are based on reflective, reciprocal, responsible relationships to place. It's actually the erosion of people's capacity and right to actually have decision-making power over their social communities and in relationship to the living systems upon which they depend that has actually resulted in this problem. Indigenous peoples who have sovereignty over their territory do not deforest. The problem and the solution have to be understood at a different scale. The strategic point of intervention isn't necessarily going to be at the level of the UN or even the level of the federal government. Are they going to lead to greater power, autonomy, and community control? Is it going to create greater democracy? Is it going to actually create the conditions by which communities can address the crisis? Or is it going to pretend that there is a single solution that will address the problem at the policy scale? So, for example, I wouldn't argue that a national, cap and trade policy is actually the right way to deal with. First of all, cap and trade doesn't work because we're talking about commoditizing the building blocks of life, which is a terrible idea. But the idea that that is going to be the solution versus something like the Green New Deal, which is actually looking at how do we create the conditions and the resource pools in order for communities to create the transition on the ground in their communities. And that's how we should be thinking about this. And that's what works. Because the truth of the matter is grassroots organizing has kept more industrial carbon out of the atmosphere than any state or federal policy to date. There has not been a mass waste incinerator built in the United States in well over a decade. And that is because of grassroots organizing. And if you calculate the amount of industrial carbon that has been kept out of the atmosphere by communities shutting down dirty coal-fired power plants, communities fighting against fracking through rights of nature ordinances, we have kept more industrial carbon out of the atmosphere by communities building power to defend their rights and the rights of living systems than any state or federal policy.
Yes. And I actually just had a conversation with Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who is behind the policy of the Green New Deal, or one of the people. And she thinks that a lot of politicians think, once we get the policy settled, then they'll take over and thank you, kids. Thank you for your time being a part of this, and let the adults handle it from now. But she was like, we're building into the fabric of it that it is everyone has a place at the table, like Starhawk says,
Yeah. One of the things that I will say that challenges me and that I find problematic in the mainstream of the climate movement is we're still arguing about A, whether climate change is real, and B, we're using very broad language that's the do something language, like that we need to do something about climate change. And actually, the battle right now isn't about whether we do or do not do something about climate change. It's about what we're going to do. It's about who's going to define the solutions. Because it is not the case that our choices are do nothing and anything we do is the right thing to do. We have to actually take seriously crafting and articulating the solutions that we need. Right now, at the same time that Trump is denying that climate change is real, the same people who support Trump and the fossil fuel industry are investing in geoengineering. They're investing in carbon capture, sequestration technologies. They're investing in all kinds of false solutions. They would much rather a cap and trade system or carbon tax than actually reducing emissions at the source and protecting communities' health and well-being. The idea that we just need to do something is actually a dangerous frame. Because anything is better than nothing will lead to nothing or worse. Otherwise, we will end up with policies that both don't work and further consolidate power and maintain the status quo of the industry.
Right.
And actually, I think the frame we should be using is a health frame, which gets down to like the level of the child, the family, the community, the ecosystem, the bioregion, and the planet. The point at which we need to take action on climate is the point at which the destruction is happening. It's at the point of extraction, the power plants, the refineries, the drilling. We should be looking at the implications of those activities on the health of communities, the health of individuals, the health of environments and ecosystems, because when we only talk about it in terms of atmospheric concentration of CO2, and when we say that we just need to reduce either the temperature or the amount of greenhouse gases, we enable all kinds of false solutions. So there is urgency. There is an absolute urgency to the moment, but we cannot allow urgency to enable desperation because desperation enables false solutions.